Okay, so today I would like to talk about why many black people are not so proud of their race, are not so proud of associating themselves with the continent of Africa. When I talk about black people, I'm talking about Africans on the continent, Africans in the diaspora, the Australian Aboriginals, the Dravidians. Okay, so one of the reasons is because Africans, or the black race rather, has suffered a tremendous loss of status in the world today. And this is down to the incredible success of white supremacy, or European imperialism, or Western racism. The three are one and the same thing. I don't draw any distinction between the three. I use them interchangeably. So, what is white supremacy slash European imperialism? It is a system of disadvantage based on race. It is a global power system of mass oppression, a global behavioral phenomenon practiced by a small group of people who classify themselves as white. It is a system, it is an institution that has been put in place by the ruling elite, by the establishment that rules this world, and it is centered on racist ideas, around racist ideas. Basically, it necessitates the ability to hold down and control a significant segment of the world's population, economically, politically, and socially, by imposing laws and restrictions on their lives. Now, to a large extent, the European imperialism that we're experiencing in the world today was set in motion by an act of criminality that we call colonialism. This illegality was started by Christopher Columbus and his gang. It laid the basis for Western racism. It laid the basis for misconceptions about people. It laid the basis for the use of Christianity as a rationale for the enslavement of a people. It laid the basis for not just the colonization of a people, but the colonization of the information about history. It laid the basis for divine white right, for the bogus concept of a chosen people, that people of European descent were a chosen race by God, designed to rule over lesser breeds. And this concept still influences our lives today. The Americans call this concept manifest destiny. Many people of African descent do not understand the quintessential Africa that existed before our contact with the Europeans, and the pride that should have come from such knowledge. I would like us to take a walk into the historical contribution of black people on the continent. Our contributions in the area of architecture, in the area of medicine, astronomy, astrology, mathematics, and spirituality. The author of The Miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson, said that every man has two kinds of education, that which is given to him and that which he gives to himself. Of the two kinds of education, the latter is far more desirable, for that which you are merely taught seldom nourishes the mind as that which you teach yourself. So the oldest form of writing is African. It is the Medunetha, which means writings of God. The Greeks would change it from the Medunetha to hieroglyphics, which meant sacred writings. As old as the Medunetha is, it is older than ancient Egypt. It is not even ancient Egypt. The origin of the Medunetha is actually Ethiopian. It is Sudani. Okay? So Africans were the first people to read and write. Africans were the first people to develop culture and civilization. The oldest means by which a people identified a creator is African. Africans were the first to develop a mind science that would later evolve, that would later metamorphose into spirituality, the purpose of which was to cultivate man from a beast man or a savage man into a god man. The origin of astronomical sciences is African. For thousands of years, the Dogon tribe in Mali, an African tribe, was plotting an invisible star called the White Dwarf Sirius B. Now, this is an imploded star and it is impossible to see with the naked eyes. The Sirius A is very visible to the naked eye. You can see the Sirius A, but the Sirius B is impossible to see. It has a magnitude of about 8.5. Now, the Dogon tribe were able to see the White Dwarf Sirius B, And not only see, they were able to plot its orbit and its trajectory right up to the end of the 20th century. Modern sciences were only able to see the Sirius B with the aid of an advanced telescope in the 1950s. Africans were smelting steel at 1850 degrees Celsius in a single stage process about 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. No single steel smelting machine in all of Europe was able to achieve that until William Siemens began the process of mass producing steel around the middle of the 19th century. The first mathematical papyri is African. The first medical text is African. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is as old as 1600 BC, at which time there was no Greece. The founding date of Greece is put at 753 BC. And mind you, it is only called Edwin Smith Papyrus because Edwin Smith bought the papyrus in 1862. It is purely an African text. And this papyrus has chapters on intestinal diseases, it has chapters on pregnancy diagnosis, on the circulation of blood, on ophthalmology, on gynecology, on hematiasis, and other areas of medicine. Africans were found to be using aspirin, tetracycline, as far back as 1,400 years ago. The West only started using tetracycline in the 1950s. What about the area of architecture? The first colossal stone structure in the world, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, or the Step Pyramid of King Zoser, which is a 205-foot high monument, the equivalent of a 19-story building, which still stands in the Saqqara necropolis in Egypt today, was designed and built by an African, a black man by the name Imhotep. Imhotep is the world's first multi-genius, the first multi-dimensional character in human history that we have proper details about. Imhotep was many things. He was a quintessential scientist, he was a priest, a poet, a scribe, an educator. He was the chancellor of ancient Egypt. Or put better, he was the Grand Vizier to King Zoser. He was an architect, and above all, he was the world's first physician, to whom Hippocrates, that the Greeks and other Europeans call the father of modern medicine, is giving Imhotep credit and calling him the god of medicine. In his own words, Hippocrates will say, "I am a child of Imhotep." Not only did Hippocrates idolize Imhotep so much, but he worshipped in the temple of Imhotep, in the shrine of Imhotep. Imhotep lived nearly 2,000 years before Hippocrates. The 19th century Canadian physician, Sir William Osler, wrote about Imhotep, and he said, Imhotep was the first scientist to have clearly stood out in the midst of antiquity. Now, in his lifetime, Imhotep diagnosed and treated over 200 diseases. He was believed to have treated tuberculosis, gallstones, arthritis, appendicitis, and gout. He also performed surgeries. You heard it right. He performed surgeries. Now, Imhotep was the first man to be deified when he died. By that, I mean he was the first man to be made a god when he died. Temples were built in his honor. He was referred to as the supreme healer. The Greeks would change his name to Asclepius, the one who comes in peace, the god of healing. I mean, he was known and is still known for a common saying today. He was the architect of the saying that eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. Professor Kaba Kamene, who is a renowned author and Pan-African historian, tells us that Imhotep was not only an African, Imhotep was a Twa, or a Twa Mbuti. The Twas are today derogatorily referred to as the Pygmies. They are a tribe of people who live in and the forest of Congo, of DR Congo today, parts of Rwanda, parts of Burundi, and parts of Cameroon. They are the most maligned, and some of the most maligned and some of the most disrespected Africans on the continent today. Disrespected and maligned because of the fact that they have not fully embraced European civilization, and also because they are not so endowed with heights. They are some of the world's shortest people. So they live in the dense forest of Congo, and they are being hunted down for different ritual purposes. What about the calendar that we use today? The calendar of 365 and 1/4 days that we use today is African. The 12-month calendar year is African. It was invented in Ethiopia in 4200 BC. The Africans had 12 months of 30 days each, making 360 days, and then they had 5 days at the end of the year that they used for Festival of the Gods. Now the Greeks would come in and would change that. They would take the 5 days at the end of the year that the Africans used for Festival of the Gods, and they would spread it across the 30 days. And then they made February 28 days, and some months 30 days, and other months 31 days. Now, the oldest documented date in the world is 4230 BC. That is over 6,200 years ago. And at that time, the Africans already knew that the earth was round, and that the earth rotated on its orbit around the sun, and that it took 365 and 1/4 days for the earth to make a complete orbit around the sun. Now, after listening to all of this, you're probably going to ask, but what happened to Africa? I'll tell you what happened to Africa. The Holocaust of enslavement happened to Africa. It had a devastating effect on Africa. It took over 150 million people. And I'm being conservative now with that figure, because many people put the figure to as high as 250 million. And by the Holocaust of enslavement, I'm talking about the transatlantic slave trade and the trans-Sahara slave trade, or the Arab slave trade, which began at least 800 years before the Portuguese began taking slaves out of Africa in 1442. So we're looking at about 1,000 plus years, at least 1,200 years of consistently taking the youngest people, the most capable men out of Africa, most of whom were in the prime of their lives. And family networks were disintegrated and diseases were introduced into Africa. We had no gonorrhea, we had no chlamydia in Africa before our contact with the Europeans. What about rinderpest? That's another disease that was introduced into Africa by the Europeans, and it killed a lot of cattle in Africa. In Tanzania alone, it killed over 5 million cattle. Another good reason why many people of African descent are not so proud to identify with the continent of Africa is because, economically speaking, Africa is in a deplorable state, and it has been in that state for decades. Now, in the 1970s and the early stages of the post-colonial era, many African countries were doing well. Their economies were thriving. They were in the early embryonic stages of industrialization. Africans were not crossing the Mediterranean in droves in a desperate bid to get to Europe for economic refuge. It was not an African thing at that time at all. Then came the 1980s. The two Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, conspired to devalue African currencies so that the industrialized nations, they call them the G7, which is Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the UK, Canada, and the United States, could come in and buy buy our raw materials at cheaper rates than they used to buy, process these raw materials into finished goods, and sell it back to us at higher rates. So the Africans are selling their raw materials cheaper than they used to sell, and they are buying it at higher rates than they used to buy. So the countries become weaker and the economies begin to weaken. And when your economy begins to weaken, the first instinct is to take loans. So they run to the IMF for loans, and the IMF gives them conditions under which to give them these loans. One of which is to privatize. To privatize what? To privatize their raw materials, their companies, and the IMF is specific as to whom to privatize to. It tells them the G7 nations. Investors are coming from the G7 nations, and they're interested in gold, they're interested in oil and gas, in diamond, in coltan and vanadium, in uranium, in copper, and a host of other raw materials. Raw material is the basis of a nation's strength. It is the basis of nationhood. It is a nation's bargaining power in the global marketplace. You cannot have nationhood if you do not control the wealth-producing resources of your country. Now, what used to be in government's hands, and by extension in the hands of the citizens, is now in private hands, is now in foreign hands. And foreign hands means more jobs for foreigners, less jobs for the citizens. Unemployment rises. The economy becomes weaker. So the government tries to raise money by raising taxes. Interest rates rises. Life becomes unbearable for the citizens, and they seek greener pastures abroad. And where else will be more attractive to the citizens than the G7 nations? How can we as Black people change the way we see ourselves and the mother continent? We can begin by changing the version of history that was given to us by our enslavers. Only then can we change our consciousness, and through our consciousness, change our continent, and literally change the world. Professor John Henry Clarke, in emphasizing the need for Black people to love themselves, to love their skin color, once suggested that Black people stand before a mirror and not leave that mirror until they like what they see. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing once suggested that every Black person should find a picture of the darkest person they can find and hang it in their living room, so that as they look at that picture every day, it works on their subconscious mind and renews a sense of pride in their race. Thank you for watching. Like, share, hit the subscribe button, and comment. Thank you.